Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing Game 4 of the regular season and the fourth regulation loss of the season for the San Jose Sharks as they drop to the Nashville Predators 5-2. So there is, of course, some bad news when it comes to this, but there's also some good news, I would say. Of course, the bad news is that this is the Sharks' fourth regulation loss. They're 0-4 on the season. They've got 0 points. They sit last place in the league as they're one of the few teams who have actually played 4 games. I mean, in contrast, the Hurricanes have played 4 games and are a perfect 4-0. So definitely, you could say, deserving for the Sharks to be near the bottom here. They, while they did manage to score 2 goals in this game, this is still only 5 goals over 4 games compared to the fact that they could score 5 goals in a single game last season. The offense continues to really have dried up, I guess you could say. However, there is good news, as when you compare this to the performance the Sharks put up in Game 1 of the regular season, there has been some slow and steady improvement in the Sharks game. As I said, Game 1, awful game against the Golden Knights. Then in their rematch, the Sharks looked a bit better, but clearly not good enough to win. Then against the Ducks, it was a pretty decent game for the Sharks, even though it was likely the Ducks' game to win. But here tonight, they likely deserved better than the result they were given, as they, you could definitely say, outplayed the Nashville Predators for good chunks of this game. Now, in the first period, it was pretty even between these two teams. The Predators were the only team to actually score. That was Roman Josi. Then in the second period, it was Roman Josi who added to that with a 2-0 lead for the Predators. However, at that point, it was Evander Kane in his first game back from suspension. He made it 2-1, and from that moment on, the Sharks mostly just took over. Now, they could never actually get this game tied, and eventually it would be a 2-on-1 where Turris would make it 3-1. And then a 3-on-1 where Forsberg would make it 4-1, and the Sharks could never really claw back in after that. They managed to get a Burns goal to make it interesting and 4-2, but eventually Fabro added with the empty net to make it 5-2 Predators. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, and Jones, it's a bit difficult to say because in isolation, none of these goals are necessarily his fault. Some perfect snipes on Josi's first goal, some good bounces for the Predators on the second one. Turris was a 2-on-1, Forsberg was a 3-on-1. So you take a look at just clips and you don't show that they're in the same game, and yeah, they're not necessarily Jones's fault, but you have to put it into context of the game itself. The Sharks were trailing 2-1 after the Kane goal. They were dominant. They had multiple fantastic offensive zone shifts. They kept Matt Irwin on the ice for over 3 minutes when they string together like 3 offensive shifts that barely ever left the offensive zone, even if they didn't actually manage to score. And so the one moment where it's Dylan Gambrell who makes a fatal error at the blue line and it's a 2-on-1 going the other way, you really need your starting goaltender to make that save, and Jones is unable to come up with it. Again, not necessarily a routine save, but you want to see him come up big. The rest of your team is really pouring it on, and Jones just ends up letting that one in, and it is quite deflating for the team to then go down 3-1. And of course, the fourth goal was also not much his fault, as Erik Karlsson gives basically a gift-wrapped present to the Predators in the events of a 3-on-1. But again, maybe you want Jones to try and come up with a bigger save. Not so much on that one, as that was quite tough, but definitely on the Kyle Turris goal. So all in all, not a terrible game by Jones objectively, but taking a look at it contextually, you have to say that Jones needs to be better, like he was in that first game against the Golden Knights. Next is the power play, which finally showed some life as the goal by Evander Kane was on the power play. He actually took the spot of Timo Meier on the first unit. It ended up being Burns, LeBanc, Couture, Hurdle, and Kane, and that looked pretty good. I did point out that the Sharks power play has had some solid movement in the past couple of power play opportunities that they did have. They just could never actually find a way to get it into the net. Tonight they managed to do it and still showed some pretty solid movement, so I think there is still some sparks of hope when it comes to this power play. Hopefully this Kane goal does open the floodgates and maybe the Sharks can actually start pouring it on from here on out. You know, with the Sharks offensive play so far, maybe I don't have that much hope for that, but I think there is something there. Next, I will talk about Joe Thornton, who actually has been a bit of a disappointment, not just in this game, but in the season as a whole. Of course, there was a lot talking about Joe Thornton, where this was, his first offseason in a while where he wasn't having to rehab his legs. He sustained big leg injuries in the going into the 17-18 offseason, going into the they're going into the 16-17 offseason, going into the 17-18 offseason. So going into the 18-19 offseason, it looked pretty clear that Thornton was going to be able to train, and it really isn't showing all that much thus far. And it's not just the speed or the back checking that has been an issue for Thornton, because those were issues last season, and you sort of just took those because of what Thornton brought on the offensive side. He's actually looked a bit lost at times, where the vision isn't necessarily where it used to be. There are times where he gets the puck and he sort of freezes up a bit, I guess you could say, and he's unable to really get much of a pass off. So it's just been a bit sad to watch Joe Thornton in these first 4 games. There is still ample time during the regular season. Maybe he needs a game off. I'm not entirely sure. I feel like this early on, you're probably not going to do that, especially still with some injuries here or there from players like Marcus Sorensen. But I do have to hope that Joe Thornton does pick up, maybe with, his friend Patrick Marleau coming back to the Sharks. It'll give him a little boost of confidence, because right now it's not looking all too good. Finally, I will talk about Burns and Carlson. Now, of course, in my Game 2 review, in the second game against the Golden Knights, I brought a whole huge point about how the Sharks needed to change their play style around because Burns and Carlson were making too many errors. Well, I won't bring all of that up again today. I will say that Burns and Carlson, the giveaways are just getting tiresome at this point. I mean, Carlson, as I said, gift wrapping that 4th goal for the Predators. Burns wasn't punished, I don't believe, in this game on any particular giveaway, but there were still multiple. These two players really need to clean up their game, and I think they need some sort of accountability in this, because both players know they're going to get about 25 minutes a night at the very least from DeBoer, and I think that at some point you have to try and maybe not bench, as of course you can't really afford to bench either Burns or Carlson at this point, especially with the Sharks 0 and 4. You need your best players playing. But you take a look at someone like Mario Ferraro. If he were to make a play like Carlson did on the Forsberg goal, he probably wouldn't even play the following game. He'd likely be healthy scratched if the Sharks at least had the option to do that. Maybe the Sharks would have to play Ferraro in that situation because of the amount of injuries they have on the back end with Heed and Prout and Middleton. But I feel if the Sharks had a multitude of defensemen ready to play, Ferraro would likely get sat. Burns and Carlson could have 3 giveaways on the same exact shift, and they'd likely be back on a minute later. So that could be a reason why they don't do it. Now, I'm not saying, hey, Carlson, don't make passes like that anymore, because that's how you really limit a player. But there needs to be some sort of accountability, because the Sharks really just cannot get away with making these amount of giveaways, especially with Martin Jones, who isn't the best goaltender in the league. He was quite good for them in the playoffs this past season, but it's been pretty certain that he's now mostly an average goaltender in the NHL. And so if you're going to give up these 2-on-1s, these 3-on-1s, these breakaways, you don't have John Gibson in back of the net. You don't have Sergei Bobrovsky behind you. You have Martin Jones, and you can't necessarily expect him to come up with massive, massive saves every single time. So there needs to be some sort of responsibility here from both of these two defenders. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They will face off against the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, the Sharks' first 4 games have been against rather tough opponents, the Golden Knights especially twice, the Predators here. The Ducks weren't expected to be that tough, but they have looked good to start the season thus far. I believe they are 3-0. The Chicago Blackhawks are not expected to be that great, although they are 1-0, having beaten the Philadelphia Flyers. Oh no, they actually lost that game, so I guess they're 0-1. So the Sharks should have an opportunity here to get their first win against a pretty weak Chicago team, I'd say, but I guess we'll see what happens if the Sharks can't put up any goals. Class dismissed.